Welcome, everyone. I am Catherine Reynolds Lewis. I'm the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, whose mission is the financial and emotional sustainability of freelancers of color. I want to, first of all, thank everyone working behind the scenes to make this webinar possible. Sarah Sterland, Carly Lanning, Saida Shabazz, Valeria Fernandez, and our IIJ team, Grace, Mia, and Arohi. And especially I want to thank our sponsor for this webinar, our first sponsored webinar. Huge thanks to the O'Brien Fellowship in Public Service Journalism, which since 2013 has supported 9-month reporting projects proposed by 40 journalists based in the US. Reporters selected for this Milwaukee-based fellowship at Marquette University get a $75,000 stipend, student interns as reporting partners, and funds for reporting, travel, and research. In service of the fellowship's mission to identify problems and potential solutions, O'Brien projects have tackled issues around environmental and racial justice, inequities in education and healthcare, criminal justice, and more. And I'm a very proud alum of the O'Brien program and grateful for their support. So I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator today, Jaeah Jonae Lee, who is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and a 2021-22 Knight Wallace Reporting Fellow. She's written for so many places that I wanted to write for: California Sunday, 1843 Magazine, Columbia Journalism Review, Topic Stories, Vice News, and Mother Jones. She's a recipient of the American Mosaic Journalism Prize for Excellence in Long-Form Narrative Reporting on Underrepresented Groups in America, and you can read the rest of her bio in the chat, which is extensive and impressive. And I'll briefly introduce our other panelists before turning it over to Jaeah. Sarah Carr has covered education for the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Slate, and many more, winning numerous awards. Past fellowships include the Spencer Education Journalism Fellowship, which she's also can talk about as the current recruiter, I believe is your title, Sarah, and the O'Brien Fellowship as well, and the Russell Sage Visiting Journalist Fellowship. She is the author of the fabulous book, hit myself, Hope Against Hope, sorry about that, about New Orleans schools after Hurricane Katrina, which was selected as a campus-wide read at Tulane and Macalester. And she has taught and worked in many wonderful places that you can read in her full bio. Fernanda Santos has focused her career on elevating the stories of underrepresented and misrepresented communities. She got her start in journalism in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, her home country, and was the first Brazilian to become a staff writer for the Washington Post, a writing coach in the,
For the New York Times.
the New York Times. I jumped over to the wrong line. For the New York Times, where she worked for 12 years. She's a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, a writing coach in the Poynter Institute's Power of Diverse Voices, another wonderful program I highly recommend, and a co-writer of the off-Broadway musical Americano. Her first book, The Fire Line, is about one of the deadliest wildfires in US history, and she's at work on a memoir. And last but definitely not least, Cerise Castle is a Los Angeles-based journalist specializing in arts and culture, civil rights, criminal justice, and human interest stories. She wrote the first history of deputy gangs inside the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. She also created, produced, and hosted A Tradition of Violence, a podcast detailing the history and criminal activity of deputy gangs. That reporting earned her multiple awards, including the 2022 International Women in Media Foundation's Courage Award and the American Mosaic Journalism Prize. She has produced and hosted segments for the Emmy Award-winning nightly news program Vice News Tonight. Sad to read names of programs that are gone, NPR, and nationally syndicated radio program Marketplace. And she has extensive credits that you can also read about in her bio. So thank you so much, Cerise, for being here today. Thank you all again for being here for this conversation. I'm looking forward to learning, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jaeah Jonae Lee.
Thanks, Catherine, so much for bringing us all together. I am so excited to be here today with our panelists. They have so much to share, and I have so much to learn, and I hope you all will too. I wanted to start just with a little bit of an origin story type question. I wondered if each of you could share a little bit about your freelancing journey, how you got started, how you first started like getting on editors' radars, the kinds of projects you're working on today, and in between the biggest like challenge or lessons that you have learned. Um, does anyone want to kick us off? Otherwise, I will go in order of who I see on my screen, which is Cerise.
Yeah. I'm sorry, my audio is kind of choppy. Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, I was asking about starting, how you got started on your freelancing journey, how you got on editors' radars. If you can talk a little bit about the long form projects you're working on today and some of the biggest challenges or lessons that you've learned along the way.
Of course. So I got started freelancing in college. And that was just a product of really student loan debt that motivated me to go out and seek, bylines and that sort of thing. And there was a pretty strong culture at my college to begin working in your field immediately. So that's what got me started freelancing. And I continued that after I graduated on my quest to find my first job. And starting out, it was just cold emailing people, finding publications and editors that I thought would be friendly to the kinds of stories that I was doing, and just reaching out. Throughout college, I would meet more professors that were working journalists and ask them for advice, pitch to them in their capacities at work, and with, some mild success. Then I had a couple of staff positions, but in between all of those, I always went back to freelancing. And I was able to do that just by, staying in contact with folks that I had worked with in the past and keeping them up to date on what I had been working on. And just continuing to keep that relationship solid, which, some of the editors that I work with today I've known since I was like 18 years old, which is really nice. And they've, watched me grow over the years. As far as long-term projects that I am pursuing at the moment, the deputy gang story is something that I think I'm always going to be working on in some capacity. So right now what that looks like is just probably primarily just like maintaining the databases of deputy shootings and gang members that I've built, and continuing to follow on legal cases that are making their way through the courtroom pertaining to assaults and deaths by alleged deputy gang members, and just staying on top of all of that.
Amazing. Fernanda?
I have a very different journey because I had been employed full-time since pretty much the start of my career as a journalist in this country in a long time ago, in 1999. I kind of went from one full-time job to the next, but when I left the New York Times in 2017, I started teaching. And that's sort of like what opened up the opportunity for me to write for other publications, not the ones necessarily, not just a single publication that was, always the case for me. At that point, obviously, I had a number of years as a journalist under my belt. People knew my name, knew who I was, but I still had to reach out and to editors. I still had to pitch stories and come up with ideas for stories in a different way than when I was a full-time writer, because the bar is just a different relationship that you have, right? what was interesting to me in this journey is that this idea of being a freelance writer was really broad for me. I didn't just think of writing for, newspapers or magazines or digital platforms. I thought about writing, period. I had written a book already, The Fire Line. I wrote that book while on staff for the New York Times. I took 9 months of book leave and really worked on writing during those 9 months, having mostly reported the book while also working for the Times. It was a crazy period in my life. So I got very interested in magazine stories. I reached out to an editor at the New York Times Magazine, sort of cold emailed, but obviously she knew my name, and wrote a couple of pieces for them. The Washington Post was looking for columnists in different parts of the country. I was in Arizona at the time, and it sort of made sense for me to work with them as a contributor. And I started, working as a consultant to at the time, a very new script to a musical based on the real life story of a dreamer from Arizona, someone I knew well and I had written about. And one thing led to another. Next thing I knew, they said, join the team, we want you to be one of the writers on this. And so, it's not the traditional route, but I think the greatest thing for me has been to approach my the opportunities as a writer very, very broadly, which now has been very helpful to, I resigned from a position I had full-time in August. And while, I'm sort of figuring out what to do next, I jumped on and latched on to this freelance independent journalist, independent writer side of me. So I'm currently working on a travel story that combines, sort of self-fulfillment and a little bit of a love story thing for a magazine. And I am finishing up the hopefully last round of revisions on my memoir. So that's the longest of long forms. And so this is what I'm working on right now, and trying to, I'm working on putting together really sort of broad set of services, I guess, I can offer as a consultant to, again, branch out and have different opportunities. I think the big lesson I've learned is to always be open to that our skills as journalists are really, really broad, and they can be used in a lot of different ways. So I'm really open to that right now.
That is amazing. One day I need to hear more about how you wrote this musical. So many different genres. Sarah, would you like to go?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's great to be here with all of you today. And I've been an education writer for the last nearly 25 years. And I've had two stints as an independent journalist. The first was nearly 15 years ago, and it really happened organically that I left my staff job to work on a fellowship in a book project, and then by the time the fellowship was over, I had some pretty steady freelance contracts lined up in New Orleans, where I was based, and really wanted to have a lot more kind of flexibility to finish and promote the book. This second time, which started 2.5 years ago, I would say it was not quite as organic. It was just sort of a sudden impulse. I had a staff job leading an education reporting team at the Boston Globe at the time, but I think had sort of somewhat subconsciously really missed being an independent and freelance journalist. And it was really just a matter of kind of in the space of a couple months getting to offers for pretty substantial freelance assignments that came out of nowhere and really wanting to do them. And realizing that I couldn't if I stayed in my staff job. And so I had to sort of do some work to make sure that financially I would have enough coming in to make the transition out. And I would say, kind of leaping ahead to the challenge, that's I'm kind of, I think, borrowing some terminology from Catherine Lewis, but just sort of a challenge for me has consistently been kind of striking the right balance between passion and pay. And I feel like I've been really lucky in that they've never become like totally mutually exclusive. But there have definitely been times when I've had to kind of turn down, or more often kind of put aside, what I feel most passionate about, just to make sure that I'm able to pay my bills and make this sustainable. In terms of, I do not feel, and this is a real challenge as an independent freelance journalist, but I do not feel like I'm the greatest networker. And I feel like key to me has been that I've been covering one topic for so long that I've built up a lot of contacts through education journalism circles. And that's a main way that I've been able to get new assignments and work. And in terms of what I'm doing now, I have a few pieces that I'm working on related to educational inequities that have been a long time in the works, including one that's coming out in a couple of weeks in Scientific American. That's kind of a perfect example of that passion pay, because I've had to work on that off and on over 2 years, just because I didn't always have funding for it. And there's a podcast that I'm trying to get funding to revive, called What My Students Taught Me, where I interview teachers about a student, a former student in most cases, who really challenged them in some way, and then interview the student about the same series of events and weave it into a back and forth audio narrative. And knock on wood, I think I'm pretty close to getting some funding to restart that. So excited to be here.
I think the three of you is such a wonderful example of, like, the old adage, like, there's no like one path to becoming or sustaining life as a freelancer. You all have so many excellent examples, and just what a wonderful career you all have led. I want to take that one of the last points you made, Sarah, and segue smoothly into our next question, which is one of the most common questions I get as a freelancer, about, like, how to make it all work financially, how to find some semblance of stability in this work. Whether it's between, like, juggling a bunch of different stories that are in different phases, as you alluded to, Cerise, there's always a juggle. Fernanda also, various long-form projects at certain points, juggling it on top of a staff job. Same for you, Sarah. There's a constant sort of, like, side hustle, a sense that, like, you need these side projects, or you need an anchor gig or a staff position to sort of subsidize. Sometimes, we are lucky enough to get a fellowship, like the O'Brien, to support, like, a year-long project. Oftentimes those projects go on for more than a year. At least in my case, I've found that to be true. So I wondered if each of you could talk a bit about how you've made it work. I personally can relate to, if you have run into any challenges. I think that's, like, a universal experience as a freelancer, is how to, figure out how to keep the lights on while sort of like nudging along these longer form projects, which often require a lot of upfront investment. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts there. Would any of you like to go first if anyone wants to jump in? Otherwise, I will start again with Cerise.
You have to start with someone else this time.
Okay.
I can jump. I can
okay.
go first.
Fernanda.
Again, I think, this is really interesting because each of us has such a different journey. But as I mentioned earlier, when I left the New York Times, I went to work full time as a college professor at the Cronkite School at Arizona State, and that was really a great job for me because I felt like I would finally have time to spend with my family. And have more time for myself after, a foreverness of always being on. And I had a book idea at the time. So the college teaching job was really great. Unfortunately, I lost my husband died within months of me leaving the Times. He had cancer, so I had to restructure everything. And again, parking myself on that, not parking in a way of being lazy, but having the safety of that teaching job was great. And what it turned out is that when I moved back to New York last summer, I retained a relationship with the school, and I had this in mind, like, I don't know if this full-time job I have is going to work out. I don't know, I want to be able to have something that I can fall back on if things, for one reason or another, don't turn out the way that I wish for them to turn out. So I was able to negotiate with the university a part-time appointment, which is great. It means a little bit of money that comes in, but it comes in every month. And it also gives me the safety of, in my case, benefits. It's a 50% appointment. I still have to teach, I still have to develop classes, I have responsibilities, but it's not overwhelming, and I can juggle it with other things, and it gives me a little bit of peace of mind. I have a 14-year-old daughter, no family here, so I'm sure others in this are in the same situation, right? So there are important considerations to be made when you are responsible for somebody other than yourself. So I think teaching is great. There are adjunct jobs. They usually don't pay a lot, some universities more than others, but I think it's a good way to get some income coming during a semester, on a semester to semester basis, or academic year to academic year basis. Also having access to a community at a university. Many times in journalism schools, you have adjuncts or people who are actively working as journalists, so you can network within the confines of your university job and meet other people and collaborate in projects with them. It has happened to me, and I've been very grateful for that. And something else that I think is really important to do is ahead of time, ask the people who commission you to do something when you take on, is when can I invoice? How long does it take for you to pay? Those are questions that I think younger people, especially because I have younger people who come to me and I say, how much are they paying you? How much time is this going to take you to do? Is this really worth it? Because it may be $1 a word, but if you're going to spend so much time working on it, you're actually making really, really little money. So sometimes you have to do it to put your name out there to create a relationship, but other times it's not worth it. So you got to be able to figure that out. But it's really important to get the financial side of things really clear, and a document signed by both sides, so that, if they don't fulfill their side, you can go back to them and say, we have this signed document and you have to fulfill this. And I always ask, when can I invoice? Because I find that usually I don't even say, when can I invoice? I said, so can I send you the invoice when the story goes to copy editing? Already assuming that, instead of waiting until the story is fully edited and out at publication, because I have not had a publication that has told me not to do that, which then, you can gain a few weeks, it can help you by a few weeks sometimes or more, depending on how slowly that publication decides, how soon or how long it takes for the publication to put out your work.
Sarah, thank you for that, Fernanda.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated your suggestions about when to invoice, and just being upfront and asking those questions about how long it takes to get paid. Another thing that I've had to learn as a freelancer is just to schedule time to handle the financial invoicing piece of it. I have one very part-time project management job where I get paid by 8 separate partners in a collaboration. And so just, they all have different invoicing processes. So I think I make it work, and I try to get through that as quickly as possible, but I definitely do have to schedule time for that piece of it. To go back to kind of look at financial sustainability, we've touched a little bit on fellowships, and I wanted to add some thoughts there. That fellowships have been really crucial for me the last couple of years in terms of making it sustainable. And I think, definitely looking back a decade ago, I really underestimated the range and diversity of fellowships that are out there, and had thought, just really knew about kind of the most well-known, and had thought they were mostly for kind of respite and research. Whereas right now I'm all about kind of getting funding to produce work. And I do think it's worth the time to reach out to fellowship directors and alums of different fellowship programs you're interested in, to learn more about their experience and how it works. This isn't the case for every fellowship, but definitely, when I applied for the O'Brien a couple of years ago, the fellowship director was great about just batting around different ideas I had and looking at drafts. And I know that there are other fellowships out there as well that do that. And that one was I really had to think through whether it was the right fit for me at the time. But I feel like if they're not willing to kind of make the time to go through those particulars, you have to think about whether it's just a good opportunity in general. Another point about financial sustainability is just I've had to be open to doing non-journalistic work. Right now, it's actually not any part of my time, but it really has been off and on over the years. And, helped some academics create a podcast about teaching math. And I've done a lot of editing for an education-oriented think tank. And I try to kind of approach that work similarly to the journalism contracts, and sort of thinking about that balance of passion and pay, and just, making sure that I'm not taking on any non-journalistic work that I wouldn't be comfortable being totally transparent about. So those are 2 thoughts. Cerise?
Yeah, I feel like I don't really have like a lot of like good advice on this. Like for me personally, like this has been like very like precarious the entire time that I've done it, even with fellowships and taking on side gigs. I recently like took on a side gig where they just like didn't pay me after 4 months of work, and there really isn't a lot of good recourse for that. So I was out like 10 grand. So like I don't know. And even with like fellowships, like the last fellowship program that I was in, I had to pay for everything myself up front, and I didn't receive my fellowship funding until like several months after the project was done. So that really wasn't helpful either, because I ended up going into a bunch of credit card debt to try to finish my reporting. So I'm sorry, I haven't really had like great experiences with financial sustainability. It's just sort of something that I've accepted, I guess, begrudgingly accepted at this point. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's real. I certainly relate to that very much. I would say, like, in the 7 years I've been freelancing, many of them have also been precarious. Like, I've sort of tried all of the things each year. My tax person once told me that she felt really bad for me because every year my income was just like, it would, one year it might look stable, but it was never like, I never got to the point, and this is still a juggle I'm figuring out. And I think it's so hard for so many freelancers. It's why it's like the number one question that tends to come up, because the nature of it is really hard. I think some years I've been lucky. The year that I won the Mosaic Prize, which is $100,000 no strings attached cash prize, but that is not solicited. That was just like crazy luck. Cerise and I have both been lucky enough to be recipients of this award in different years. But that, like, in that year, it looked like my income was like excellent, but that's not something I can replicate year to year. I've tried to rely on fellowships, and I've been somewhat lucky on that front. But yeah, it is hard, and there's kind of always this question of like, what's going to happen when this gig or this fellowship runs out. I do think all the tips that Fernanda and Sarah mentioned are super helpful, and at least like trying to set you up for success. But I also relate to, like, I have tried side hustles that are non-journalism, and I guess I've just been less lucky on that front, or at least like feel I'm not as fast of a worker, so the hourly rate doesn't like necessarily justify spending all the time to do that work, and then like sort of lose that time, or take that time away from the journalism. It's an ongoing question for me personally as well. And in the chat, if folks have their own tips, please do share them, because I think every person's experience can be different, and it's always helpful to hear. So we've talked about money. Maybe we could talk a little bit about time management. I know each of you have your own approaches to managing your time, which is like probably the other most common question I get is like, just how do you do it? Like you're just kind of out there. Inherently, there isn't a whole lot of structure when you walk into a freelancing life. So you become your own manager, and it's probably one of the biggest, like it was one of the biggest learning curves for myself. I had to do a lot of sort of like researching and schooling about like, how do you manage your time when you are your own boss. I'd love to hear you guys talk about that a bit. I know each of you have slightly different approaches to both prioritizing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about like what your calendar looks like in a given week. I'm sure folks would love to hear. Sarah, do you want to start with this one? Because I know you were sort of, you had like a mix, and you had raised some good questions about prioritizing as well.
Yeah, I'm not, some people really like thrive on organization and just have a lot of project management systems that they recommend and use, and I just am not the most organized. So this has been a real challenge for me. And I mean, sometimes I actually crave those moments, which are pretty rare, just when I have a really intense deadline, like finishing, getting the Scientific American piece a week ago off to the printer, because I knew that's what I need to do right now. But for me, it's really just about having this really kind of ongoing to-do list and shifting the ranking of things as I need to over the course of a day or a week. But just making sure I'm updating that so I don't forget about something, which has happened before. I mean, I think another thing that has been helpful is just, and has been hard for me to do, is just trying to be more patient about projects, and really trying to kind of embrace a long view of stories and getting them done, which is difficult when you come from a background of having worked for a number of years at daily newspapers. And it can be difficult in terms of communicating with sources too. And I've tried to get to be a lot more transparent with sources up front, that I don't know where this is going to publish. There's some chance that I might not be able to find a home for it, but I'm pretty confident I'll be able to. But just because ultimately I feel kind of most responsible to just to treat them in an ethical, sensitive way when they're giving me so much of their time and often have very little time to give. So yeah, but it has required that patience. And as one example, over the summer, I had some time to begin work on a personal narrative that I've long wanted to do. But I knew that I might not have time to get back to it for a year or two, and just kind of have to have faith that that time I spent over the summer kind of getting some things and ideas off the ground won't end up being wasted time.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. Fernanda, I know you have a very regimented schedule. Love to hear you talk a bit about your approach.
Yeah, sometimes I show my kid, he'll look at my calendar. I schedule everything. I schedule, give me a call next week. I put it on my calendar. I schedule my time to go to the gym, my time to go to yoga, because it's very important to me to move, to get out of the house, to have a reason to go somewhere. So I am very regimented. I also think that having come from a background of full-time work, it's really helpful to maintain a regular schedule, because I think it's really easy when you're home and you don't really have, you have a deadline. Like I have a deadline for this story I'm working on it's actually November, let's say 15th. And I put it on my calendar for a week earlier, because I know myself, and that kind of 3-4 week time, it lends itself to me procrastinating. So I schedule, every day. I remember very clearly someone, when I was writing my book, saying, touch your work every day, even if you're not going to write, even if it's just about rereading, tweaking, you will feel like you accomplished something. The idea is to always be moving forward, right? So I schedule, okay, this number of hours, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go out and go to the gym. I'm going to do this other, networking, reach out to, and I write the names of the people that I'm going to reach out to, follow up with, and the names of the people I'm going to follow up with. I have these little notebooks everywhere. One is at my desk. I have one in my purse always, and I kind of compare the notes on one and the other. And it's mostly so that I don't lose track of things. I also think that it's really helpful to set aside time for you to not work. As much as we're, hustling for the next assignment, how am I going to pay my bills, etc. I think we really need a reset. So I have been very, very, unless it's a desperate situation, or I put myself there, because during the week I took a day like Wednesday and went to Rockaway to surf or something. I will, I will not work Saturdays and I will not work Sundays. Until evening. I usually kind of, the same way that my kid sits down to dump stuff from her folder and look at school assignments, I stop and I look at my calendar. I see what are the options, what am I going to do, how am I going to, navigate things, and who am I going to reach out to this week. I think I find that it's always helpful when I give myself a little bit of space for me to just do whatever I want to do. And the good thing is that doing whatever you want to do doesn't mean having to spend money. Like, I like the beach. I like to surf, even in the cold. I'm trying more and more to do that in New York, kind of psyching myself up for winter surfing. But taking walks, meeting friends. I've been taking advantage of having a little bit more flexibility with my time to make sure that I talk to a friend at least 3 times a week, whether, and hopefully in person. I do a lot of walks and talks, and I think that's really, really helpful to just open the mind up and feeling connected to the world, because it's a really lonely journey when you're independent. So yeah.
That's amazing. I once heard on like some entrepreneur podcasts to always, like, when you look at the next quarter, schedule your vacation time first, or your time off first, because otherwise all the stuff you have to do or need to do will get in the way.
I actually have my vacation schedule in April and my tickets bought already. So
wow, in April.
In April. I mean,
Oh
I
my
have
God.
Google, I have a bunch of Google flight alerts to all these places I dream to go. And if a deal is hard to resist and it's the right price, which in this case is Munich. And then from Munich, I'll figure out what I'm gonna do, where my money would take me, maybe nowhere, but
You are hashtag life goals, freelancer life goals. Cerise, I know you also surf. You want to talk a bit about how you work that into your work week? How you find that balance?
Definitely. I echoing the calendar. I put everything in my calendar. I pulled it up just to sort of like get a reference, but it's in there like what time I wake up. Then I usually start my day with some physical activity, usually surfing or skateboarding. And then everything is like literally by the hour what I'm doing, the project that I'm working on, the length of time. And I spend a little bit of time, I think, like at the top of the week usually, and then I edit throughout the week as time goes on, like what I'm going to be spending my time on as things fluctuate. And I also have hard rules about the hours that I'm working and when I need to stop. For a long time, I would just spend sort of like countless hours working on a project late into the night and ignore all of my other needs. But I've gotten a lot better over the past year about keeping hard working hours. So generally, I don't try to work past 5 p.m., 6 p.m. if it's like really important. Definitely not on the weekends. And again, like taking time for myself. I think one thing we don't really talk a lot about in this industry is mental health care, which is something that I think just like in general, everyone I think should have a therapist. But I think in this field, it's definitely very important, because so much of what we do is taking on secondary trauma and living with that. So taking time to one, see my therapist, and then 2, do things that keep me in a good mental health space. So, seeing friends at the end of a long day, doing those physical activities, doing fun things that I enjoy, seeing live music, hiking, taking trips, that kind of thing, seeing family, that's very important too. And I make sure that I carve out hours where that is happening as well, because it's just as important.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I feel like it's taken me a really long time to learn that lesson for myself. It's that, like, if you're not taking care of yourself, then there won't really be a you to get at the work and get the work done. And I have found that you're just more productive when you do take some time to sort of do what you need to do in the morning. Self-care all the way. I definitely, I resonate with like what all three of you have said. I feel like I have gone through seasons of being like hyper organized. Everything goes on the calendar. Everything is scheduled. To these days, I would say I'm more in the Sarah camp of I just have like a long to-do list that I'm constantly updating. Which is all just to say, you know, it could, you know, the approach that works for you could also be a seasonal thing. But I so admire the structure and the sort of like long form mentality and the playing the long game approach that each of you have taken on. All right, I have some more questions, but just given the time, and we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A chat. So let me just give this a quick scan and see. Let's see here. Okay, so we've got a few questions about balancing short form assignments and like how to make the transition into long form. Are there, okay, transition into long form. We have another question about like, are there any types of shorter form journalism that are sort of more lower hanging fruits in your mind that is helpful to cultivate in order to like build up a resume for something like a fellowship application? Does anyone want to address either of those areas?
I just want to say something briefly. I mean, I don't like I said earlier, I think that, you know, look beyond short form to finance long form, because also I think the short form pays so little and it might feel so unfulfilling. You know, there are other things that you can do, as I mentioned, maybe adjunct teaching, you know, maybe you know, people write, I've written a lot of different things. I now am very focused on writing stories that are either very human, all of my stories would be human centered, but that are where my biases, for lack of a better term, are not problematic at all. You know, that's why I love writing personal essays, commentary, opinion pieces. So a lot of times there are publications that can enter into some kind of contributor contract with you after you successfully pitch 3 stories. And that is also something that is great because it's a steady thing. You know, you're going to have, you know, to produce a certain number of stories or a certain number of words or 1 successful pitch a month or whatever it might be in exchange for a fixed amount of money. So you can always count on that. I don't like these like I mean, I'm speaking for myself, everybody's situation is very different, but I don't go after the, you know, like $200 piece, $150 a piece kind of thing, because I feel that it becomes a lot of work and it becomes very distracting to actually being able to focus on something that is more lucrative and sustainable for me. It obviously depends on how young you are, how new you are, how well known you are. So I say that with understanding very much that this is the options that others have to resort to. But if you have some, I think in general, no matter where you are, I think you should look at your skills as a writer, as a journalist, interviewing, deciphering, complicating things into more simplified language, being able to explain things well, to train other people on how to explain things well. These are all marketable, very marketable skills that you know, can be used to help you land types of work that is not like that, 500 word piece that you're going to be paid, I don't know, 25 cents a word or something like that.
And I would, those are all great insights, and add that, like, I mean, people's definitions of what's long form vary a lot. And I definitely do not do exclusively or even mostly long form. Although I like to aspire to do some of it. But I feel like they're not necessarily in these separate silos all the time. And I've definitely had cases where I've hoped to write, a 5,000 word magazine piece on a topic, and it just hasn't worked out. And I've had to kind of break it into smaller pieces, maybe into a 1,000 word piece and a 2,000 word piece. But alternatively, I've had ones where, I've been assigned to write maybe a 1,500 word piece, and I've been able to convince the publication or editor that I'm working with to do something more in depth and to give more spaces and resources for the story. In terms of breaking in with editors, I mean, if it's someplace that's brand new, I do think it helps to kind of start smaller and to initially maybe pitch more shorter pieces, and try to work up to kind of what your dream piece is for them. But I found it's just all over the map in terms of what pays. And that makes it really hard in that, some places it's just not worth the time and money to do short pieces for, but other places pay pretty well for them.
Sorry, I was just sort of meditating on what everyone has said. Yeah, I don't know if I have like anything really to add to that. I think my co-panelists like really summed that up nicely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing I learned, this is not from my own experience, but I have a good friend who is like a badass freelancer, also struggles with like finding the balance between the pay and the passion projects. But one thing she taught me was that sometimes pitching alumni magazines or sort of like subject specific publications. I don't know what the Hechinger Report's policy is on working with freelancers, but places like MIT Tech Review, which actually I think does pay a decent rate depending on the assignment. But there are certain types of short form that I've seen her do that require like, you're writing about either one person, you're profiling one person. It's based off of one or two probably phone interviews, so it translates into fewer hours but with decent pay. You always want to kind of do the calculation of what does this pay, how many words are they willing to assign. But I've seen some friends have a lot of success on that front. And if you choose to write about a person who is sort of in the field of of expertise where you would want to pitch a longer form project, that's always sort of like could provide a chance for you to learn something more about the area that whether it's the beat you're covering or the area you're interested in. But it does, there are some lower hanging fruits there. Okay, let me see here. I'm seeing a lot of questions about things like networking, sort of getting the attention of an editor, cold pitching places where you've never worked with before. One thing I'll just throw in there is sort of what have any of you ever experienced like being ghosted by an editor, or just never hearing back, and how have you coped with these scenarios?
I've been ghosted. I've even been ghosted and then seen my pitch show up written by somebody else like a month
Oh
later,
no,
which
the
really
cardinal
sucks.
sin, that is terrible.
How did I cope? I mean, I'm someone that's like, I really use like my anger and like outrage to like fuel other projects that I do. Yeah, with that, like I was really upset for probably a couple of hours and ultimately decided, okay, well, I know that the story is good because I've seen it now printed somewhere else. Let me see if I can, push it forward, find another angle, and do it at a different place. Yeah, and that's like kind of a theme for a lot of the work that I do when something doesn't really quite work out the way that I want it to. I just try to, tinker with it some more, repackage it, reframe, and see how I can push it forward.
I hope you're taking time for self-care in between.
Yes, always.
She surfs.
Yeah. Swimming with dolphins.
Yeah, I've definitely had kind of a lot of variations on experiences of being ghosted. And I mean, one thing I mean, that it comes up a lot that I'll send a pitch off and I won't hear back, and I won't know if that's because they just haven't gotten to it or because they aren't interested. And so I've tried to get a lot better about sort of setting a specific length of time and sending an email saying, that if you politely, if you don't get back by this point, I'll pitch it. I'll assume you're not interested and pitch it elsewhere. And I found that has definitely saved me time that I would have spent waiting weeks and in some cases months to hear back.
And if I can add, I think that's an important thing to remember, right? Like it's your idea, it's your story. So ultimately you're in control, waiting for editors forever, and being sad that they didn't get back to you right away. I don't play that game. It's like, 2 weeks, you haven't gotten back. A week later, I'll follow up. One more week goes by, you haven't gotten back to me. I will just out of courtesy and kind of like, making sure that my tracks are covered. I'll send an email say, I appreciate you reading this pitch. I just letting you know that I'm pitching elsewhere, and just move on. Like it's if I if we're gonna be. I was ghosted recently by an editor who I know very well because we worked for 12 years together at the New York Times. And she engaged in a couple of emails and then she completely disappeared and never even like completely stopped replying. And I felt like writing and say like, that's just rude, just say like, I'm not interested, but some people just don't have the courage. They don't have the patience. They don't have the interest. Some people are just, I'm sorry, they're assholes, and that's how it is. And you just have to say like, I got no time for you either. And it hurts. Yeah, it's hard. And this piece that I'm writing, this travel story I'm writing is a perfect example. I offered it to someone who kind of didn't think, oh, I don't see the story there. And I was like, well, I knew there was a story there and I offered it someplace else and they took it. So, one day you'll get one person who says this one pitch is not good and the same pitch to somebody else will be a great pitch. So don't get discouraged.
Yeah, I would add to that, second that as well. And the points that everybody made, it's a general theme of not giving up, but I will say, some editors are shitty and like stealing ideas, absolutely not okay. It is one of those times when I truly hate the power imbalance between like the individual freelancer and the almighty publication that has like, the money and the platform and the, but you have agency too. And I think the hard part is figuring out who are the editors that are good to work with. There are many of them out there. I think sort of like putting the word out and asking fellow freelancers, who do you like working with? I believe there are sort of now database, like paid databases with that give a general sense of what different publications pay. There's so much turbulence in the industry that list is often changing, but it's worth kind of just like, you know, having a solid group of freelancer independent journalist friends who can sort of, you can combine intel with. It's why this organization exists, in part to sort of like counteract some of these imbalances. I will make a quick plug for we have some programming that is entirely focused on pitching, so keep an eye out for those coming soon on IIJ. And I personally have come to look at pitching as not sort of like I've put in as more of like a calling card with editors. I used to think like, oh, I'm going to pour my heart and soul into this pitch. I'm going to send it to the one editor that I really want to work with on this, or the one publication that my dream pub. And then maybe I'll work my way down the list. But I used to hang a lot of hope and feelings, and rightfully so, because it does take so much work to get to the point of like having a pitch and sending it off. I've come to look at silence and like lack of response as just as like, okay, like whatever, I'm moving on to the next person. But the next time I have a pitch, if I still want to work with that editor, I will still contact them again. I've learned to try to not like see that as a total rejection, or even when they say no, this is not right for us. I still, like months or years later, will go back with another pitch, just as a way, at the very least, to remind this editor that, hey, I'm here, so they can see the kinds of stories I'm working on and interested in, and hope maybe one day they will respond and the answer will be yes. And there have been times that has worked for me. There have been other times when, to this day, there are publications I've never written for or broken into. But yeah, building up a healthy relationship with pitching, always a good thing. It is hard, but it is doable. I got booted off of Zoom, and so I sort of lost the list of questions here. Catherine or Sarah, if you see anyone sort of like common themes that jump out, could you either type them to me, or if you want to jump in and read them off?
I can be a disembodied voice. There's one here about long form requires access before pitching, and a lot of that work ends up being unpaid. So how do you balance that and financially make it work, the amount of time it takes to invest before you do pitch?
Can I start? I have a quick thing. I saw that question because I was looking at the questions. It's a really good question. I remember with my book, which I didn't have a publisher when I started, when I decided to write a book about this fire in Arizona. And I was working on my own time to do the reporting. I was very specifically interested in something that I knew I would never be able to fully explain or fully understand, and then fully explain through a story in the Times, or even if it were to be a story in the New York Times Magazine, or a series of stories in the New York Times, which I knew they weren't going to let me do anyway. So I go back to the scheduling. You have to find a way to carve out time from your schedule every day in a way that's not predatory, so that you are able to do the other things that you need to do, but continue to work on that project. So I worked I was bureau chief for the Times in Phoenix. I covered the Southwest, big region, all this, the whole state of Arizona, the whole state of New Mexico, how things played out in the region. And I had to do a lot of reporting from the city of Prescott, which is about rounding up 2 hours from Phoenix. And I routinely, like I said, I don't recommend it all the time, but I really wanted to do that. I really believed in that book, and I knew that nobody was pursuing that angle. I routinely would get out of my house at 4:30 in the morning, drive to Prescott, meet somebody for breakfast at 7, talk to them for an hour and a half, get back in my car, go back to work, go back to Phoenix, or go back wherever I was going to go, or maybe stay in Prescott for the day and, do the reporting from there, from various different restaurants and coffee shops. Thankfully, I was mobile, my hotspot, my laptop and all that before pandemics came and taught us that we could all be mobile. So I think that's really, really important. It is unpaid work up front, but I think it's important to remember that all the pre-reporting, all the research you do for your pitch is stuff that you're going to use in your story, whether in actually use or knowledge that you'll acquire that will make the writing of that story, the understanding of the story easier later on. So don't look at it as sort of like wasted time or unpaid time. It's sort of like working or doing ahead of time before you sell that pitch and start getting paid for the time that and the work that you're doing.
Okay, great. I do want to try and get to as many questions as possible. So let me bundle a couple of next ones together. It goes back to the idea of organizing and prioritizing. Mainly, we have two questions that are sort of about how to sustain your enthusiasm for a long-term project that can sometimes go on for months or even years, like a book project. Or even for magazine articles, and I've had my own experiences with this. There's always, side hustles, life distractions. How do you not lose focus? Fernanda, earlier you made the point of making sure to touch the project at least once per day. I have some of my own ways of going about this. I'd love to hear Sarah, Cerise, if you have any thoughts. I know both of you also do the juggle. And then if you have any tangible tips for keeping track of your ideas and research for these projects over the long term.
This is an interesting question. I think I've been like really blessed in that like most of my long-term projects are things that I really care about. So the motivation is just sort of it's like self-fulfilling, I guess, in a way. Probably like, I always talk about like the Deputy Gang project. Like that's something that I've thought about my entire life. And I continue to think about it when I'm not working on it. So my motivation to engage on that is extremely high. Because it's been, something I've been passionate about since I was like literally a child. Let's see, I'm working right now on a piece about school boards. And with that, I mean, it's in a community where I have like no connections, but a lot of the themes that I'm looking at touch on stuff that I dealt with when I was in high school and experiences that I had. Maybe the theme there is I find a lot of myself in my stories that keeps me interested and engaged. But I would say overwhelmingly, like I've just been very lucky in that the long-term projects that I do are things that I'm very passionate about, and that allows me to stay motivated.
Anything to add, Sarah or Fernanda?
Yeah, I mean, I agree in that, like, I mean, there's kind of an adage about writing a book that you don't want to write a book about sort of a subject or topic you don't want to live with for many years. And I have, maybe been lucky that I haven't had to take on a long form project that I don't have that passion. And the problem for me is often the opposite, and then I want to be spending all of my time working on it. But I have found for me it's helpful just to do work that just uses my mind in different ways and gives it a little bit of a balance. Like I do a mixture of my own reporting and editing, and sometimes it is kind of a little bit of a funny relief to shift into editing mode and to a project that I don't have quite the passion for, because I don't have that personal connection of having reported every word of it from, and just am a little more detached. And in the last couple of years, I've been doing an education reporting collaborative, serving as project manager of that. And it's also just sort of a different pace and a different skill set. And I think that doing that variety helps helps in a weird way to kind of sustain my energy for kind of the more intense reporting projects that I feel a lot more kind of emotional connection to, that can sometimes get a little bit more overwrought.
Yeah, I totally, that resonates, and I'll just surface a couple of things each of you said on the prep call as well that I think are applicable here. We talked a little bit about like how to like thinking through carefully when to say no, when to take on a project and when not to, particularly when it comes to long form, because there's such a big time investment involved. And you are essentially committing yourself, possibly for years, possibly for a lifetime, in Cerese's case. And also, and that also means, you know, saying yes to one thing can often means you're saying no to a lot of other things, and it works both ways. And that means you won't get to do every story that you want to do, and that's also okay. And I think making peace with that is one of the learning curves of this work. But I think these are such important points you all raised, that to really think through, like, could I live with this for many years? That should definitely be like a conversation you have with yourself before kind of going down that road. One thing I kind of learned to start doing in recent years, in terms of just like nuts and bolts, keeping track of my research progress and things like that, is just to keep a running diary. It's just a Google Doc in my case. I'll have literally the date whenever it was I started doing the research. I'll have the date, and I'll just sort of log the various things I did and searched for, and some things I learned, my impressions and takeaways. And it's a nice way for me to gauge. I have one document that's been running now for almost 2 years. And I've grown quite anxious about what's going to happen to it, whether it will ever find a home. But it just helps me sort of like look at it and refresh my memory and remember like what got me excited about the story in the first place. So I think those things, along with keeping things like a document full of the sources that you've reached out to when you last talked to them, things like that can help. We have a sort of somewhat like a location related question. One of our attendees lives in San Francisco. That's also where I live.
Catherine, you're muted.
Yes, I just want to say we only have 1 minute left, Jaeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, so are we out of time for another question? Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Unless any of the panelists wants to sum it up in like half a minute. To be continued. I want to respect everyone's time.
Sounds great. Sorry about that. And well, everyone knows how to reach us, I think. So, and yes, please attend the next IIJ session. I'll throw it back to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Jaeah. I think it's a sign when you're so engaged in the conversation, you lose track of time. And I definitely found this so helpful for my own work. Thank you so much, Cerise Castle, Fernanda Santos, Jaeah Lee, and Sarah Carr, for being here, for being so real and vulnerable. And if there are ways that you'd like folks to reach out to you aside from just social media, please feel free to put that in the chat right now. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the O'Brien Fellowship in Public Service Journalism. Sarah Carr and I both had this fellowship. It's like $85,000 when you think about the travel and other funding, and it's Dave Umhafer, who's the director, is just amazing. So if you're at all interested, Dave will get on the phone with you one-on-one and talk you through if your application is a good fit and how to make it better. And the formal stuff, I'll just read that the O'Brien Fellowship in Public Service Journalism supports 9-month reporting projects. It's based in Milwaukee, but they also have remote fellows. This is your chance to tell a story that can change policy or even change lives, while preference is given to applicants who plan to live in beautiful Milwaukee. remote hybrid applications are also accepted. The selection process begins in January, so you can get your application in sooner. For more information, see the O'Brien website and application page, and contact Dave Umhafer via email. So thank you again to everyone. We will send out a recording of this in our newsletter on Tuesday, so look for that. And again, just really grateful for this community, and we'll see you in November. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.